August 1977. It's a watershed moment in sports history, right? The exact moment Celtic's absolute icon Kenny Dalglish packed up his life and left for Liverpool. Now, we're not just going to recount a dry timeline in this explainer today. Oh no, we are going to forensically examine how this one single move totally shattered a fan base and fundamentally rewired the underlying economics and psychology of football forever.
To really grasp the sheer magnitude of this event, you've got to look right past our modern idea of a simple player transfer. Like our source material so brilliantly puts it, for Glasgow, losing their icon felt less like a transaction and way more like a visceral amputation of the club's very soul. I mean, it was a profound shock that completely severed a community from its central figure.
So, here's our roadmap. We're going to investigate the departure that shattered Celtic, profile the king of the jungle himself, dissect the actual anatomy of the exit, look at the resulting vacuum of identity, and finally unpack the forensic legacy. Let's dive in.
Part 1. The departure that shattered Celtic. A club's reality check.
Moving on to Part 2, King of the Jungle, the Celtic Talisman.
Okay, so to understand the devastation of this loss, we first have to understand the man at the center of it all, Kenny Dalglish. Universally known as the King of the Jungle, he was the ultimate symbol of the post-Lisbon Lions era. I mean, he was so deeply revered in Glasgow, you'd half expect the local statues to tip their hats when he walked by. He grew up right there in the Celtic system. He was one of their own who matured into this truly world-class playmaker. On the pitch, it was just effortless. He had this rare blend of supreme intelligence, ridiculously close control, and what honestly looked like a telepathic understanding of the space around him. He wasn't just a player, he was the absolute heartbeat of Celtic.
But context is everything, right? The 1970s were a time of massive transition for British football. The romantic innocence of the past was slamming headfirst into a cold, new economic order. The whole landscape was shifting beneath these clubs' feet. And while Dalglish was Celtic's shining focal point, down south, Bob Paisley's Liverpool was systematically dismantling the status quo. They weren't just winning games, they were building an absolute juggernaut of European royalty. When Liverpool came knocking for Dalglish, they were offering him a seat at the very highest table of the sport.
Which brings us to Section 3, Anatomy of the Exit. The real story behind the departure.
Now, the historical narrative often lazily points to just ambition to explain why a great player moves on. But the reality of this specific departure is far more painful and honestly, a lot more nuanced when you look closely at the institutional forces operating behind the scenes. It was literally a perfect storm of structural, financial, and psychological pressures.
The first massive force at play was the management gap. Just look at the stark contrast here. It's night and day. Celtic was operating with this highly traditionalist, almost paternalistic structure, and they were suffering from some serious institutional fatigue trying to replicate those glory days of the Jock Stein era. Then you look at Liverpool. By stark contrast, they were a model of absolute structural efficiency and revolutionary professionalization. For Dalglish, this was a highly tactical decision. He was choosing an environment that offered him his absolute, unfettered potential over one that was, frankly, weighed down by its own history.
So to break it down, this exit was driven by 3 huge factors. We just touched on the management gap, but secondly, there was a major financial realignment happening. The wealth gap between English and Scottish clubs was widening fast, professionalizing the English game in revolutionary ways. And thirdly, and this might actually be the most crucial for the man himself, was the psychological weight. Dalglish was bearing the completely suffocating burden of being a community's quote-unquote savior. Literally every result rested on his shoulders. Moving to Liverpool gave him a degree of anonymity he could simply never, ever achieve back in Glasgow.
And that naturally leads into Part 4, a vacuum of identity. Let's look at the immediate aftermath.
You see, Dalglish's departure didn't just leave a massive hole in the starting lineup, it created a profound tactical and emotional vacuum at Celtic Park. And this brings us to a really vital concept, the one-club man. For decades, this idea represented a beautifully romanticized era of absolute loyalty. But in the eyes of Celtic supporters, that concept effectively died right there in 1977. This loss triggered a period of intense collective grief and brought about a really harsh, cynical realization for the fans. They realized that even the most iconic, club-bred stars could, and definitely would, be lured away by the promise of something bigger. The innocence of the game was gone.
Finally, let's get into Section 5, the forensic legacy, a permanent evolution.
For Celtic, this hugely traumatic exit actually acted as a necessary catalyst. Step 1, they had to confront reality.
It forced the club to modernize and stop relying on their historical inertia to keep their stars. Step 2, they had to endure a brutally long, difficult period of institutional restructuring just to catch up to the modern era. And Step 3, it eventually led them to develop a totally new, pragmatic approach to the transfer market and a new generation of players. They had to adapt, or they weren't going to survive.
But what about Dalglish? Well, looking back, history proves that his purely professional, pragmatic choice was absolutely correct. He went on to achieve literally everything possible in the game. He became the undisputed face of Liverpool's golden age, a master on the European stage, and a highly revered tactical mind in his own right. The environment he chose perfectly unlocked the exact potential he was seeking.
So what's the ultimate takeaway of this explainer? It's a harsh juxtaposition that honestly feels just as relevant today as it did back in '77. Football is a game of brutal pragmatism. We, as fans, pour our hearts, our histories, and our very identities into these players. But for the athletes themselves, football is a career. It's a profession with an incredibly narrow, super high-pressure window to seize opportunities. And you know, that total disconnect is the exact source of both the game's greatest romances and its deepest, most crushing heartbreaks.
As we wrap up this forensic look at a club forever changed, yet still driven by intense, unwavering passion, I want to leave you with a provocative thought about our own psychology today. Given the massive, lasting impact of Dalglish's departure, are we modern fans truly any better equipped to handle the pragmatic, cutthroat business nature of the transfer market? Or, deep down, are we still just as susceptible to that exact same sense of visceral betrayal that devastated Glasgow back in 1977? Something to really think about. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it gave you a whole new perspective on the mechanics of the beautiful game.